Hello and welcome to this series of video specials on ESG and sustainable and responsible investing, brought to you by the international law firm Evershed Sutherland. In this video, we're looking at the EU disclosure regulation, also known as SFDR, for those of you who are keeping track of the acronyms. This is one of the marquee pieces in the EU's green finance package and well worth dedicating a video to. We'll look briefly at the who, what, when and why of the regime before looking at the three main categories of obligations. This is followed by a general discussion and then a more detailed look at the timeline. So, who does this regime apply to?
So it is very broad. It's quite difficult to be outside of this regime. So it covers financial market participants and also advisors. So financial market participants are defined really as the product manufacturer group. So it's slightly broader than the definition of product manufacturer under, say, MiFID II, but it does cover UCITS management companies, AIFMs, MiFID investment firms, pension providers, insurers, and also some banks. So it is very, very broad.
We do give a focus to asset managers in this video, but lots of the content will be equally applicable to other types of firm. If anyone's interested in the specific impacts on insurers or investment advisors, to the extent that we don't cover them, do get in touch. But just to be clear, the regime doesn't just attach to the activities of in-scope firms as entities, it also incorporates a number of product-specific obligations. Let's just briefly discuss what this regime wants firms to do for context, but we are going to return to this. So, as the nickname disclosure regulation suggests, it's all about disclosure in pre-contractual documents, periodic reporting, and on websites, specifically relating to a firm or a financial product's ESG characteristics and credentials or considerations. Another notable point is that SFDR can serve as the gateway to obligations under other regimes, such as the EU taxonomy. So the SFDR's product-specific obligations will trigger obligations to disclose under the taxonomy. So where are we in the process?
As you know, SFDR is a multi-part framework. So-called Level 1 regulation became law in December last year, and it's going to be supplemented by the so-called Level 2 regulatory technical standards. Those really put the meat on the bones of the framework, and they are currently subject to a consultation process that ends in September.
And the SFDR has been rising up the agenda for clients. In part, that's because despite the consultation, some of the obligations begin to fall due shortly. The first obligations come online in March 2021, although there's a whole series of effective dates for this regime that dictate when the different obligations come into play. We're going to revisit this at the end once we've explored the obligations. SFDR is a European regulation, so directly effective on member states and their businesses. It's also worth bearing in mind that Brexit may be relevant for UK firms implementing these obligations. Do check out our earlier scene-setting video, The Big Picture, for a discussion around that. You're probably getting an idea of the scale of this regime, but why do we need it?
Some commentators might say that the objectives have actually morphed since the political stages, but really what it's aiming to achieve is tackling the perceived issues around greenwashing or the overstatement of green credentials and enhancing the disclosure around products with legitimate ESG credentials.
So, as with similar laws from the EU, its stated objectives are to harmonise and level the playing field. However, there's always a risk of mission creep. This can be seen in the way that the regime is framed. It's written on the basis that firms will want themselves and their products to be in scope because they want to be seen as green. In other words, it views the world through an anti-greenwashing prism. However, since the scope is actually quite broad, firms may find that products with limited or modest green credentials or other credentials become subject to quite onerous obligations. The obligations under SFDR broadly fall into three categories. There are adverse impacts of investment decisions on sustainability factors, consideration of ESG risk or sustainability risk, and product-specific obligations. First, we have this mouthful of a phrase, the principal adverse impacts of investment decisions on sustainability factors. Hannah, what's this getting at?
So this is really looking at the potential negative consequences of an investment decision, and specifically negative consequences on so-called sustainability factors. Now, the regulation defines sustainability factors as those environmental, social, employee matters, respect for human rights, anti-corruption and anti-bribery matters.
And what sorts of obligations are associated with that concept?
Well, first, obviously, it's whether adverse impacts are actually considered as part of the investment decision. So that is, do these manufacturers need to consider how likely these adverse impacts will be on their investment decisions? So how severe they might be, how they might be mitigated, for example. And there's a long list of mandatory adverse impacts that are set out in the level 2 that Michaela mentioned. Then the next obligation, once those have been considered, is making disclosures about those adverse impacts. If you meet the definition of a smaller firm, and that's the definition of a larger firm as defined under the regulation, then your obligation is either to comply with that and explain your principal adverse impacts and the consideration of those, or if you don't consider them because they're deemed not to be relevant, then to explain that to investors why those aren't considered. However, if you meet the definition of a larger firm, then you have no option. You will need to comply and you will need to make disclosures on the principal adverse impacts that are considered, and that's from June 2021. Now, the disclosures are, for the most part, prescribed, and there are a number of tables that are set out in the level 2, setting out really the extent of the disclosures that need to be made. And then also from the end of 2022, disclosures will also need to be made at product level.
The form and content of these disclosures, and even what to disclose, isn't left to the financial market participants' discretion. The disclosures have to be made on a dedicated web page with a prescribed title and headings, and of particular significance is the series of prescribed indicators. Based on the regulatory technical standards, a financial market participant would need to make at least 34 individual disclosures in relation to specific mandated principal adverse impacts. This is then followed by how the firm assesses those principal adverse impacts or others, and a number of disclosures that supplement this, such as how they will mitigate them and the international standards that they subscribe to, such as the UNPRI. Then there are also obligations that will need to be made at product level later. So at this stage, we're really thinking about the principal adverse impacts of the investment decisions of the entities themselves. So that's one obligation. What about the second, sustainability risks?
Sustainability risk means either an environmental, a social or governance event or a condition that, if it occurs, could cause an actual or potentially a material negative impact on the value of the investment. Firms may already consider risks like these as part of their usual risk management functions to the extent relevant, but now they're going to have an obligation to disclose that information and the policies they have to integrate sustainability risks into investment decisions that they are making at firm and product level. And they're also going to need to align their remuneration policy with the integration of sustainability risk management.
And the last one, there are also some product-specific obligations and disclosures.
Yeah, there certainly are. So in addition to everything that we've discussed already around risks and adverse impacts, there is more to do if the products that you have fit under one of the buckets under the regulation. So essentially the way we're looking at it is that there are these kind of 3 buckets. So you're either an Article 8 product, an Article 9 product, or you're kind of anything else. And for the Article 8 and Article 9 products, there are additional disclosures that need to be made. So at a very high level, let's have a look at perhaps the distinctions between Article 8 and Article 9. So an Article 9 product, if we start with that, is a product which has a sustainable investment as its investment objective. And sustainable investment is defined within the regulation as an economic activity that contributes to an environmental objective or a social objective, provided that such investments do not significantly harm one of those or both or either of those objectives, and that the investee companies follow good governance practices. So this might be a fund, for example, which has the reduction of carbon emissions as its investment objective. And then for the Article 8 products, an Article 8 product is a product which promotes, among other characteristics, so it doesn't have to be the sole function of that product, environmental or social characteristics, or a combination of those characteristics, provided again that the companies in which they invest follow good governance practices. So it's not immediately clear what will fall into the Article 8 bucket, and there are certainly some themes that we're looking at that need a little bit more detail and understanding. So, for example, what meets the good governance test? What does promoting those characteristics mean? And there has been a little bit more guidance coming out from the industry and in the level 2 as to how we can interpret those provisions. But it's certainly a little bit of a watch this space at the moment to see which bucket products do fit into. But I think what we do know for an Article 8 product is that simply a concept of ESG integration might not take you far enough. But again, it needs to be a case-by-case distinction. So once you've determined whether or not a product that you have is in Article 8 or Article 9, there is another raft, surprise, of additional disclosures that you will need to make. And those will need to go across pre-contractual documents. So those going to your investors before the contract, so prospectuses, for example, for the use of management companies and AIFMs. You'll also need to make updates across your websites, and certain of those disclosures are kind of mandated. And there's additional detail in the RTS about the extent of and the level of information that needs to be included. And also disclosures will need to be made in the reports and accounts. So there's quite a lot to do and a lot of disclosures to be made.
So, as you can see, there is a lot to do, starting in March. And most firms' work on this appears to be in the relatively early stages.
So I think from our perspective, what we're seeing is clients still feeling their way on this a little bit. And that's largely for the reasons that Hannah and you have outlined already, that the RTS is still in consultation. There are a number of other industry initiatives going on. So people, we haven't landed on a final position yet on a number of these things. And I think, as we've discussed in other videos, we still have the Brexit conundrum and how Brexit is going to impact. So still a number of unknowns. But what we are starting to do and work with clients on is some scoping. We've been doing quite a few workshops with clients to help them work out whether they're in Article 8 or Article 9 or not. And then to start thinking about the disclosures in quite a degree of granularity. So people are starting to take initial steps to think about how they may implement, but still with the knowledge that we haven't got the final position yet.
Scoping has been a challenge. We've put together a number of flowcharts and notes to try and establish the perimeter of these requirements, but what can firms do to help themselves in that regard?
I think there are a number of things, really. And I think, as you mentioned, Phil, we've been doing quite a lot on this. And almost each time we do it, you find another little nuance in the rules or in the RTS or through another briefing that's come out. So I think it's really important that firms understand that they will be caught by this and start to do an assessment of their products and of their funds that they're selling to try and work out whether or not at a high level at the moment they're captured. So a lot of our clients might not have any funds or products which have any ES or G type of element at the moment, but I think that is likely to change. And I think we are seeing more people start to incorporate themes around ESG integration or screening. And I think it's also important to note that even where you do have these products, they might be called a sustainability fund, but that might not put them into the bracket of an Article 9 product automatically. So I think there is quite a big kind of gap analysis that could be done now to try and help firms to determine where they might fall here. And then as a more general point, I think it's because of the timings and because we know that so many people are caught and there is a lot to do. I think it's really important that the right people from the right sides of the business are involved to really kick this project off.
We've also seen firms explore legal boundaries of their obligations and whether they're in scope of some of the obligations on a fully must comply basis or a comply and explain basis. Most firms want to move towards a more sustainable investment approach, but the obligations are onerous. Do you think that perhaps firms are keen to move forward, but perhaps at a slower pace?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, because I think what we know from some of the other press and where we are generally, that ESG is not going to go away. It is going to continue. So I think a lot of firms, as clients want these type of products, will start to launch these types of products, which will then, of course, bring them into scope. So I think it's difficult to say that this won't be something that firms will need to consider in the future. But as Michaela mentioned, we do have the Brexit conundrum, and that's meant that it's not quite clear at the moment where some of the RTS lie and the extent of some of the obligations. So whether some firms will perhaps maybe do a best efforts basis to try and be consistent with other firms who perhaps have a kind of a cross-border basis sales. But at the moment, it's still a little bit unsure, I think.
Now, while firms are looking to improve their credentials in this space, this comes with a cost. A key question here will be whether this has a downstream cost implication for products and services.
So obviously, I think you're alluding to the ability to source data and the need to pay for data provision, due diligence, etc. There clearly is a cost to providing these ESG products. You're right also that supervision by the likes of the depository may also involve them in more work and upskilling, which again might lead to a need for them to also increase costs. The sort of $1 million question is, of course, will investors stand to bear those costs themselves, or will they see those as falling onto the managers? And I guess we wait to see where the market goes on that. But there might be a payoff there between increased performance, given that we're seeing ESG products performing pretty well at the moment, and whether clients will be happy to pay a premium if they are getting a premium return.
We thought it would be helpful to close on a practical guide as to when the various obligations come online. The emphasis here being on financial market participants themselves, not, for example, the deadlines for policymakers. The first impacts of the regime are in 2021, specifically the 10th of March, when the bulk of the obligations come online. That includes the comply or explain obligation in relation to principal adverse impacts, the publication of sustainability risks at firm and product level, and the requirement to align remuneration policies with sustainability risks, and the Article 8 and 9 product obligations. In June 2021, the enhanced obligation regarding principal adverse impacts for larger financial market participants comes online. And if we move a little further forward in the timeline, the next milestone is actually the end of 2021, as this signifies the end of the 2021 reporting period. And that's significant because the obligation to do reporting begins immediately afterwards. That reporting must be published by the 31st of June 2022. So, to be totally clear, such reporting would cover a period up to the 31st of December 2021. And that reporting might have started on the 30th of June 2021 for many firms, i.e. the larger financial market participants. It could have feasibly started on the 10th of March 2021 for financial market participants who opted to comply rather than explain. Or it could have begun at some other period when the firm opted in, if it was later than that. Finally, there are new obligations that come into force in December 2022 for the disclosure of principal adverse impacts at product level. We provided an overview of what's coming, but we aren't able to go into all of the obligations here. If you need further assistance, we do have scoping materials, tools, and hours worth of training materials. So, last thing that remains for me to say is thanks so much for watching. If you found this video useful, please do check out the other videos in this series. You can also send some feedback to your usual contact at Eversheds Sutherland. This series is a totally new format for this team, so if you think that this setup or parts of it should become part of our new normal, we really do want to hear it. And if you're interested in workshopping the issues in this video or to discuss any of our other services, please let's talk. Bye for now.